The room was silent when she entered, not the kind of silence that waits, the kind that judges. Cameras whispered in clicks, court stenographers flexed their fingers, knowing today would not be routine. And behind the mahogany bench, Judge Marcellus leaned forward, eyes unreadable, but already weary of what this case represented. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Wearing a muted navy suit and her signature poise, she walked through the packed courtroom as if the weight of a $500 million penalty didn't exist on her shoulders. But it did. Every outlet from CNN to Fox News had already printed the number in bold. $500,000, a fine so grotesquely large it wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. Some thought she'd fold, some hoped she'd snap, but she did neither. Instead, she stopped just before taking her seat and slowly turned to face the courtroom gallery. Her voice didn't tremble. "You want to fine me for breaking a system that was already broken? Go ahead, but don't expect me to stay quiet about who's really pulling the strings." A few gasps. One camera shutter froze mid-click. Holmes didn't even blink. Seated across the aisle, Senator Granger Holmes smirked faintly, as if this courtroom had always been his to command. He adjusted his cufflinks, leaned in, and whispered to his lawyer. "She'll crack before cross." But Jasmine's eyes had already moved past him, to the file on her table marked 3 Horns, Internal Comms, Unredacted. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing how power punishes dissent, and how sometimes the courtroom meant for your execution becomes your stage for rebellion. The paperwork was thick, dense, designed not just to accuse, but to drown. 347 pages of civil allegations laced with terms like campaign fraud, undue influence, and malicious misappropriation. He kind of language meant to paralyze reputations in motion. Jasmine Crockett had read it line by line, not because she needed to, because she wanted to know every thread they tried to weave around her throat. The fine, $500 million, filed under a rarely enforced section of the Federal Campaign Enforcement Statute. The suit accused her of funneling dark money through independent PACs, citing coordinated media influence, unregistered digital lobbying, and patterned transactional opacity. But the timing? That was the real tell. Just 7 days earlier, Jasmine had publicly exposed Senator Granger Holmes for concealing energy stock holdings while pushing legislation that gutted water protections across rural Texas. Her questioning had gone viral. His face, flushed with quiet panic on C-SPAN, had trended for 2 days. Now, this. She sat across from her lead counsel, Maya Hernandez, who skimmed the final page and sighed. "This isn't about campaign violations," Maya said, low enough that only Jasmine could hear. "This is political decapitation." Jasmine kept her tone steady. "Then let's make sure the blade doesn't land where they think." The man behind the filing, Holmes, wasn't just a senator. He was the architect of what Crockett once called gentle tyranny. He smiled for the cameras, quoted scripture during hearings, and carved loopholes into environmental law with surgical precision. Behind the scenes, he was a major shareholder in Crosslinks Energy and sat on the advisory board of a data firm known as 3 Horns Analytics. And that was the problem, because every piece of evidence used to justify the fine came from 3 Horns. Jasmine tapped the folder in front of her. It was filled with FOI requests and confidential memos, documents that didn't just poke holes in the accusation, they raised questions about who manufactured it. "They thought I'd be too busy defending myself to ask who built the rope," she said. Maya leaned in. "They've spent months preparing for this. We have days. You sure you want to take this to the wall?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "We don't have to burn it all down. Just pull the right thread." Outside the courthouse, talking heads framed the story as scandal. A congresswoman under siege. A Democratic firebrand finally caught cutting corners. But inside her office, Jasmine wasn't panicking. She was building. By nightfall, she had compiled a list of names, subcontractors, analysts, donors, and back-end developers tied to 3 Horns. One in particular stood out, Deshaun Pierce, a former data operations manager who had suddenly vanished from the firm's public staff list a month ago. She circled his name. "He's the key," she whispered. Maya frowned. You think he flipped? I think he tried to warn someone. And I think they buried him for it. The clock ticked toward trial. The news cycles were sharpening their headlines. And in the echo chamber of digital media, the number, $500 million, became a symbol, not of guilt, but of power, flexed like a fist. But what they didn't realize was simple. Crockett had no intention of playing defense, not when the real offense had been happening in the shadows all along. The next morning, as she walked back into court, she didn't bring a plea. She brought a plan. Senator Granger Holmes didn't need a gavel to command silence. He'd been doing it for decades, with money, legislation, and calculated pauses in front of cameras. To the public, he was the picture of stability, southern drawl, tailored suits, war veteran lapel pins, and Sunday morning scripture quotes, the kind of man who invoked the founders when cornered and smiled like he still believed in small-town decency. But Crockett had seen behind that grin. She'd once stood opposite him in a subcommittee hearing on water contamination in East Texas. Families had shown up with photos, kids with nosebleeds, grandparents with cancer, and Holmes had dismissed it all as regional anomalies. She had stared him down that day, voice sharp as glass. You've turned public policy into private investment strategy, and now you want to blame the groundwater. He hadn't responded then, but he had remembered. Now she was the one on the stand, or so they thought. Holmes wasn't listed as a plaintiff in the suit. He didn't need to be. The PACs funding the litigation, CleanGov, Future Liberty, and American Foundations Initiative, were all cross-linked through shadow donors. Jasmine's team had already traced 3 of them to cross-links, the same energy company Holmes secretly held board options in. It wasn't illegal, but it was obvious. Everything about this stinks, Maya muttered, eyes scanning through campaign finance disclosures on her tablet. His fingerprints are on every page, but legally, he's not even in the room. He doesn't have to be, Jasmine said, gazing toward the media swarm outside the courthouse window. He wrote the script, we're just reciting it. Granger Holmes, meanwhile, was across town at a closed-door fundraiser in Austin. Surrounded by oil lobbyists and evangelical megadonors, he smiled like the trial was already over. Cameras weren't allowed, but one hot mic clip caught him mid-joke. $500 million, that's not a fine, that's motivation. He wasn't just aiming to sideline Jasmine, he was trying to bury her brand. Turn her into a cautionary tale for every woman of color who rose too quickly, spoke too loudly, or refused to fold politely. That's why this mattered. This wasn't a trial. It was a warning to anyone who disrupted the formula. Jasmine stood in front of her whiteboard that night, lines of string and names spiderwebbing across it. They think they're building a narrative, but they're building a noose, one they're about to trip over. She circled a photo of Three Horns Analytics founding team. There he was again, Holmes in the background of a gala, hand on the shoulder of their CEO, Martin Kessler. Three Horns wasn't just a data firm. It was a weaponized PR machine, producing custom analytics, campaign heat maps, and reputational counter-strategy briefs. Kessler had testified before Congress once on ethical boundaries in political data work. Jasmine remembered that hearing. He said they only used public data. Maya raised an eyebrow. What's your point? That's a lie, Jasmine said, eyes narrowing. I want every client report that firm produced in the last 5 years, especially the ones they tried to erase. It was late. Washington slept, but the machinery of narrative control never did. Holmes was playing the long game. Death by perception, trial by saturation. One scandal headline at a time until her name meant nothing but controversy. But Crockett had studied the rules, and more importantly, she'd studied what happens when those rules only apply to some. This time, she whispered, we don't play their game. We flip the board. Outside, the Capitol lights flickered in the heat. The air felt heavy, not just with summer, but with something slower, older. Retribution, maybe. The third floor of the federal courthouse felt like a theater with no exit signs. Rows of observers packed into the gallery. Reporters scribbled headlines before the first word was spoken. The smell of wood polish and cold ambition clung to the air. This wasn't just a trial. It was a national broadcast dressed in legalese. Jasmine Crockett sat at the defendant's table, chin high, gaze steady. She'd worn gray, neutral, unshakable. Beside her, Maya Hernandez organized the tabs on her binder, hands calm but sharp with purpose. Across the aisle, the prosecution team exuded entitlement. 3 men in navy, suits and red ties, flipping through arguments they believed were already won. At their center sat lead counsel Mark Ellison, former prosecutor, current political fixer, and a man who had once called C-SPAN the new battlefield. He stood and began with precision. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about politics. It's about patterns. It's about a public servant who manipulated the trust of her voters to build a digital army of influence, with dark money and no accountability. He paused, letting the word manipulated hang like smoke. Our evidence will show coordinated donations routed through shell packs, payments to political influencers, a deliberate effort to disguise those payments as operational support. This is not free speech. This is financial deception. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. Not yet. Ellison continued. When campaign finance law is ignored, democracy suffers. That is the story of this case. The judge gave a measured nod. Defense? Maya stood slowly, calm, almost casual. Our position is simple, she began. The prosecution isn't showing you a crime. They're showing you fear. Fear of what happens when a woman doesn't wait her turn. She glanced toward the jury, then the cameras. They're accusing my client of hiding money, but we'll show you that the real cover-up lies with the very people pointing fingers. The data firm they rely on has a documented history of digital forgeries and partisan manufacturing. The judge arched an eyebrow. You're referring to Three Horns Analytics? Yes, Your Honor, and we've subpoenaed their internal audit reports, which were deliberately excluded from discovery. A ripple moved through the room, but the moment that shifted everything came during cross-examination of the prosecution's forensic analyst, a man named Brent Keller. Maya leaned in during questioning. Mr. Keller, have you ever worked for a political campaign? I've done consulting. Specifically? Cambridge Analytica, 2016. A murmur broke out. The judge struck his gavel once. Silence returned. But the damage was planted like a seed. Maya didn't stop. Did you use predictive psychographic modeling in your analysis of Jasmine Crockett's packs? We used standard pattern recognition software. And that software, is it proprietary to Three Horns? Keller hesitated. Yes. Maya turned to the jury. So the same company that supplied the prosecution's evidence also built the algorithm that determined guilt. Ellison stood. Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Move on, Ms. Hernandez. But the impact had landed. Back at the defense table, Jasmine's voice was low but steady. He blinked. Maya nodded. They thought this courtroom would be a coffin, but it's starting to look like a mirror. Outside, news networks began altering their chyrons. Crockett accuser tied to Cambridge Analytica. Three Horns under scrutiny. The spin was wobbling, and inside the chamber, for the first time since the trial began, the jurors leaned forward, not to judge, but to understand. The courtroom had been built like a trap, but Jasmine had just found the spring. They weren't supposed to see him again. Deshaun Pierce had vanished 3 months earlier, erased from company records, his LinkedIn deactivated, his phone disconnected. Crockett's team had chased dead ends for weeks. Whispers said he'd been paid off, or silenced, or worse. But on the 5th day of trial, as the courtroom buzzed with the dull repetition of finance jargon, the side door opened, and there he was. You could feel it. The room shifted, eyes locked, pens paused mid-sentence. Maya stood. Your Honor, the defense calls Deshaun Pierce for sworn testimony. Mark Ellison nearly leapt from his chair. Objection. This witness was not disclosed in pre-trial filings. Because he was in hiding, Maya shot back. From the very company the prosecution relies on for evidence. Judge Marcellus stared at Deshawn for a long moment. Mr. Pierce, are you willing to testify under oath that you were threatened into silence? Deshawn nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. The judge motioned him forward. Deshawn's hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in. He wore a faded jacket and the kind of eyes that had seen too much for their age. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but not from weakness, from pressure. I worked at Three Horns Analytics for 5 years. My team was instructed to assemble a dossier on Reperal Jasmine Crockett. We were told to focus on her donation funnels, but the data we had didn't support the claims they wanted. What claims? Maya asked gently. That she coordinated illegal funding. It wasn't there. So they told us to build a model that implied coordination, pattern recognition that would pass legal muster if no one dug too deep. He looked straight at the jury now. I refused. 2 days later, I was locked out of my company email. Security escorted me out. They said my position had been eliminated. I never got severance. Ellison was already objecting again, calling the testimony hearsay, unreliable, politically motivated. But the jury? They weren't looking at him anymore. They were watching Deshawn. Maya walked forward, holding up a printed email. This was leaked to our team just last night, dated 6 weeks before the fine was issued. It's a communication between Senator Holmes's chief of staff and Three Horns CEO, Martin Kessler. She read aloud. We need something sharp, something public. If you can get us just enough to justify a major filing, we'll handle the rest. Another wave of gasps. The judge banged his gavel. Order, now. Judge Marcellus stared at Deshawn for a long moment. Mr. Pierce, are you willing to testify under oath that you were threatened into silence? Deshawn nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. The judge motioned him forward. Deshawn's hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in. He wore a faded jacket and the kind of eyes that had seen too much for their age. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but not from weakness, from pressure. I worked at Three Horns Analytics for 5 years. My team was instructed to assemble a dossier on Reperal Jasmine Crockett. We were told to focus on her donation funnels, but the data we had didn't support the claims they wanted. What claims? Maya asked gently. That she coordinated illegal funding. It wasn't there. So they told us to build a model that implied coordination, pattern recognition that would pass legal muster if no one dug too deep. He looked straight at the jury now. I refused. 2 days later, I was locked out of my company email. Security escorted me out. They said my position had been eliminated. I never got severance. Ellison was already objecting again, calling the testimony hearsay, unreliable, politically motivated. But the jury, they weren't looking at him anymore. They were watching Deshawn. Maya walked forward, holding up a printed email. This was leaked to our team just last night, dated 6 weeks before the fine was issued. It's a communication between Senator Holmes' chief of staff and Three Horns CEO Martin Kessler. She read aloud. We need something sharp, something public. If you can get us just enough to justify a major filing, we'll handle the rest. Another wave of gasps. The judge banged his gavel. Order, now! But order was already lost. Crockett leaned back in her chair, steady, but her pulse thundered in her ears. The courtroom had just changed. The prosecution's anchor witness had been quietly discredited, and now a whistleblower stood under oath, implicating the machinery behind the entire fine. Outside, reporters scrambled to rewrite their scripts. News tickers flipped. Analysts pivoted. Inside, Ellison tried to recover. The witness has no physical proof. His testimony is subjective. But Maya was ready. She dropped a USB on the evidence tray. We have the original source code, she said, pulled from an internal server backup Deshawn kept when he left. It shows deliberate falsification. The judge raised an eyebrow. And the chain of custody? Filed and time-stamped. Already submitted for review. A long silence. Then softly from one of the jurors, is that legal? The courtroom was no longer about Jasmine's guilt. It was about why this case existed at all. And that shift, that fracture in the foundation, couldn't be patched over. Not by spin, not by suits, and not by any fine, no matter how large. The room hadn't yet settled from Deshawn's bombshell when the gallery doors creaked open. And in walked Senator Ted Cruz. No announcement, no press advisory, just a tailored suit, a knowing smirk, and a man who knew he wasn't just stepping into a courtroom. He was stepping into a battlefield. Maya glanced at Jasmine, whispering, "He's not supposed to be here. He's Senate oversight, not a party to this case." But Jasmine already knew. Ted Cruz didn't need permission. He made the spectacle. Judge Marcellus raised an eyebrow. "Senator Cruz, you're not scheduled to testify." Cruz offered a cordial nod, stepping confidently past the gallery ropes. "I'm here under Article 2 privilege, Your Honor, as a material witness and as part of the Governmental Ethics Subcommittee overseeing campaign finance." He turned slowly to the jury. "And because what's happening here has national consequences." The prosecution team shifted nervously. Ellison leaned toward his mic. "Your Honor, this is a disruption." "I'm not here to disrupt," Cruz cut in, voice smooth as oil. "I'm here to clarify." He turned to Jasmine. "You've built quite a reputation. Ion, Congresswoman, Twitter firebrand, viral interrogator, but behind all that, there's one question this country deserves to know." He paused, dramatic, rehearsed. "Did you knowingly coordinate with offshore donors during the 2024 campaign cycle?" The silence was razor wire sharp. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood, calm as a still lake. "Let me be clear, Senator Cruz. I've answered this before, under oath, multiple times. The answer is no. But..." Cruz lifted a folder, theatrically. "This wasn't reviewed before." He pulled a glossy photo from within, a blurred image of Jasmine exiting a Dubai conference room with a known crypto financier. "This was May 2023. The man beside you, Akram Jalil, now faces federal investigation." Whispers echoed across the courtroom. Jasmine's lawyer rose to object. "This isn't admissible. It's out of scope." But Jasmine raised her hand. "No, let him finish." Cruz leaned forward, voice low, dangerous. "You took donations from a PAC 3 weeks later. That PAC received funding funneled from Jalil's shell companies. Coincidence?" She met his gaze. "No." "Targeting." He blinked. She took a breath. "You know exactly what happened in that meeting, because I invited State Department observers to witness it. That photo, cropped, out of context, convenient for your narrative, but let me return the favor." She motioned to Maya. On the screen behind them, a video loaded. Cruz, at the same Dubai conference, shaking hands with the same financier, smiling, and whispering something. The video zoomed in, no audio, but the timing. 3 hours before Jasmine's meeting. The courtroom cracked like a lightning strike. Gasps, cameras clicking, reporters scrambling. Maya's voice was quiet but sharp. "If proximity equals guilt, then what exactly were you doing there, Senator?" Cruz's smile faltered for just a second, then returned. He straightened his tie, stone-faced. "This is a distraction." But the damage was done. The jury was watching now, not just the facts but the motives, and the power plays, the theater of it all. And for the first time, the prosecution didn't look like truth seekers. They looked like politicians. Jasmine sat back down, composed. Cruz exited without another word, but the moment hung in the air like smoke. Not because of what he said, but because of what he failed to answer. They didn't speak it aloud, but everyone in that courtroom felt it. The jury was shifting. It wasn't sudden, not a gasp or a declaration, but a series of glances, quiet scribbles, one juror tapping their pen nervously against the edge of the bench, eyes lingering longer on Jasmine than they had before. The balance was tilting, and Jasmine felt it in her bones. Maya whispered, "We just cracked something open. Cruz tried to corner you and slipped into his own trap." But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She knew better. This wasn't victory. It was momentum. Fragile, fleeting, and it could vanish in a second. On the prosecution side, Assistant Attorney Ellison shuffled papers with a little more force than necessary. His jaw was tight. His tone, when he rose, was sharper than before. The defense has conveniently shifted the spotlight, Your Honor, but this court isn't about distractions or viral videos. It's about the facts. He turned to the jury. We'll present new testimony tomorrow from a federal financial analyst who traced the cryptocurrency chain, and that will show beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Crockett's campaign received tainted funds. Jasmine stayed still. Let him speak. Let him reveal just how weak the core of their case was. Tangled theories, questionable witnesses, and speculative timelines. The judge nodded. Very well. Court will recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow. Gavel. Echo. Movement. But no one was really leaving. Not mentally. The gallery buzzed. The media scrambled out first, clutching their footage like gold. And the jury. They stole one last look at Jasmine before exiting. A different look. Not sympathy. Not bias. Curiosity. Maya leaned in again, lower this time. Did you see Juror 4? He's the finance guy. He's not buying it anymore. Jasmine allowed a faint nod. But then a voice. Soft, southern. Congresswoman Crockett? She turned. A woman, maybe late 50s, press badge around her neck, stood hesitantly by the railing. She didn't look like mainstream media. She looked like someone's aunt, the kind who'd bring you cobbler and ask if you'd eaten today. Jasmine gave a nod. Yes? The woman approached gently. I'm from a small local outlet. Used to be just print, now we do live streams too. I've been covering this trial every day. My viewers, they've been watching closely, especially the young black women. Jasmine's posture softened. I appreciate that. The woman hesitated, then added, today was the first time they started saying something different in the comments. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. They're saying, maybe it's not about guilt or innocence anymore. Maybe it's about power. Who's allowed to have it, and who's punished for using it? That landed heavy, not just on Jasmine, but on Maya, who overheard it too. Because that was the real trial happening here. Not over donations, but over audacity. The audacity to speak, to question, to stand in rooms not meant for you. Jasmine nodded slowly, holding the woman's gaze. Thank you for telling me. A pause. Then Jasmine added, just loud enough for Maya to hear. They're not just watching this trial. They're watching us. Outside, protesters were gathering again, not screaming, but singing. A quiet spiritual, haunting, unapologetic. Inside, the courtroom lights dimmed. Outside, the storm was coming. And for the first time, it wasn't just Jasmine who was ready. The world was listening. No one expected what came next. Maya's hand trembled slightly as she placed a small, unmarked envelope on the evidence table. The judge eyed it warily. Defense counsel, you may proceed. Jasmine leaned forward, voice steady but heavy with anticipation. This envelope contains audio recordings recently obtained from an anonymous source inside Three Horns Analytics. They capture conversations between Martin Kessler, the CEO, and Senator Holmes' chief of staff. Ellison's face tightened. Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is unverified and prejudicial. The judge held up a hand. Play the recordings. Let the court decide. The courtroom fell silent as the first grainy voice crackled through the speakers. It's time to make sure Crockett doesn't get another platform, the voice said. The $500 million fine is just the beginning. We need to control the narrative. Another voice, colder, replied. The data firm's report is solid, but the media spin must be relentless. Push every angle, financial misconduct, foreign ties, reckless campaigning. The judge's eyes flicked toward Holmes, sitting stiffly in the back row, expression unreadable. Maya pressed play on a second recording. Keep the pressure on her staff, Kessler instructed. If we can sow internal distrust, she'll implode before trial. The jury shifted in their seats, Reporters whispered urgently. The courtroom was no longer about legal technicalities. It was about conspiracy. Jasmine's gaze met Holmes for the first time since the trial began. No words, only the cold exchange of truth exposed. Ellison rose, voice strained but defiant. This is fabrication, manufactured by the defense to distract and slander. But the seed had been planted. Outside, social media exploded. Clips of the recording circulated, sparking outrage and calls for investigation. Inside, Maya leaned close to Jasmine. They thought they could buy silence, but we just bought the microphone. The judge called for order, banging the gavel. But the courtroom had already changed. For the first time, Jasmine's fight was no longer just about a fine. It was a battle for the soul of democracy itself. The courtroom lights felt colder that day, harsher somehow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Jasmine sat alone for a moment before the proceedings began, fingers clasped tight around a water glass. The weight of the $500 million fine, the endless scrutiny, and the relentless political warfare pressed against her chest. Her mind flashed back to the countless nights spent poring over documents, the whispered phone calls with whistleblowers, the faces of constituents who believed in her. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed in her head, her mother's, steady and unwavering. Speak your truth, no matter what. And so, when the judge called the court to order, Jasmine rose. Her voice cracked on the first words, but she pushed through. I stand here not just as a defendant, but as a woman who has fought to bring truth to light in a system built to silence us. She paused, eyes flickering toward the jury. For every accusation, there is a story they don't want told. For every dollar they say I hid, there are millions wasted on corporate interests that harm the people I represent. Her shoulders squared. This trial is more than numbers or laws. It is about justice, not just for me, but for the people whose voices are drowned out. A hush fell. Even the prosecution's stern faces softened, momentarily unmasked by the raw emotion. Outside the courthouse, news anchors broke in with updates, the narrative shifting subtly, from scandal to struggle, from accusation to resilience. Back inside, a juror shifted, stealing a glance at Jasmine that was less judgment and more understanding. Maya caught her eye and nodded slightly. The moment was fragile, but it was real. Because in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just fighting a $500 million fine. She was fighting for every unheard story, every quiet battle against corruption, indifference, and injustice. And for once, the courtroom was not a cage. It was a stage. One where the fight for truth, dignity, and power was no longer hidden. Jasmine's eyes burned with a quiet fire as she sat down. The courtroom had changed, and so had the stakes. The courtroom was electric. All eyes fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she stood for cross-examination. Mark Ellison stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his smirk barely concealed. You've painted a compelling picture, Congresswoman, but let's get to the facts. Jasmine met him evenly. I'm listening, Ellison began. Your campaign allegedly coordinated payments with independent PACs to influence elections without disclosure. Isn't that correct? No, Jasmine replied, voice calm but firm. What you call coordination is a series of legally vetted partnerships. He flipped to a page. Then explain this email chain where your chief strategist discusses ensuring message consistency across platforms. Jasmine's lips curled into a faint smile. Messaging is public relations. It's expected. Isn't that coordination? Ellison pressed. It's communication. There's a difference. Ellison's eyes narrowed. You claim no knowledge of funds from offshore donors? I have no evidence otherwise, Jasmine said, and my campaign complies fully with FEC laws. Yet you met with Akram Jalil, who is under federal investigation for illicit funding. That meeting was public, with State Department observers present. My team vetted all donations meticulously. Ellison's tone sharpened. So, you expect us to believe you had no idea the PACs received money from his she-oil companies? That's not on me. It's on the enforcement agencies to investigate and prosecute, not to weaponize baseless accusations. The judge leaned forward, Congresswoman Crockett, please answer the question directly. Jasmine held the judge's gaze. With all due respect, Your Honor, the prosecution has presented no direct evidence linking me to illicit funds. Ellison's frustration flickered. Jasmine seized her moment. You claim this case is about protecting democracy, but what you're really doing is protecting special interests from accountability. A hush fell. She continued, voice rising slightly. When power fears exposure, it lashes out with fines, with media storms, with legal assaults meant to silence. Her eyes swept the courtroom, landing on the jury. But I'm not afraid, and I will not be silenced. Ellison faltered, searching for a retort, but Jasmine's final words hung heavy. The truth will outlast any fine. The courtroom erupted in whispered reactions. The tide had turned. No longer was Jasmine merely defending herself. She was commanding the narrative, and everyone knew the fight was far from over. The courtroom waited, breath held, as Judge Marcellus prepared to deliver his ruling. Outside, thousands had gathered, activists, supporters, and reporters, their phones live-streaming every moment. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge's voice cut through the silence. After careful consideration of the evidence, testimony, and the credibility of all parties, this court finds that the $500 million fine imposed upon Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby vacated. A murmur swelled, disbelief rippling through prosecution and gallery alike. Judge Marcellus continued. Furthermore, the court recognizes the deliberate manipulation of evidence and political interference that compromised the integrity of this case. Jasmine felt her heart pound but remained composed. Maya exhaled softly, fingers gripping the bench. Holmes sat rigid, face pale, but unreadable. Outside, a cheer erupted, a tidal wave of relief and triumph that spilled into the streets. Jasmine stood, voice steady but charged. This verdict is not just mine, it belongs to everyone who dares to speak truth against entrenched power. She looked toward the jury, then to the courtroom crowd. Let this be a reminder, justice is not a commodity for the highest bidder. It is the foundation upon which democracy stands. Reporters flooded her with questions, but she held one message above all. The fight continues, for transparency, for accountability, for every voice silenced by fear. Later, in a quiet corner of the courthouse, Jasmine and Maya shared a look, one that spoke volumes. They had weathered the storm, but the real work was just beginning. Because in a world built on power and secrecy, victory was not a moment. It was a movement, and Jasmine Crockett was ready to lead it.